So good morning, everybody. So dear friends of the democracy, it's great to open our fifth or last day of this fifth edition of the Festival of Citizens' Participation and Deliberative Democracy. Indeed, it's only a couple of days after the biggest European election, second biggest in the world, the European Parliament election, that we talk of democracy from the various facets, also this side of the deliberative, participatory way. And we have already spent 2 days in delving in those issues, the challenges, the solutions. So I want to welcome you now then to the third day. We will sit here with my colleagues soon, but I would also like to welcome besides all the participants, the members of the Joint Research Centre Board of Governance. So that is something that is, we wanted to show really also the broad scale of the research that we are doing, including in this area of the democracy. So welcome you all. When we bring citizens closer to the policy making and decision making, we want to, through this, deal with very complex issues. In the last years, this complexity has come specifically in front with the Green Deal, the sustainability crisis, the triple crisis, so the climate change, environmental degradation, and then also the biodiversity depletion. So these are all existential threats, not only to us in Europe, but globally. But we want to, in Europe, do our part and do that well to bring indeed the solutions. And that was then the European Green Deal. We have reached a lot during the last mandate of the Commission, and then naturally with the full thank of our legislators, Council and the Parliament. But there are still gaps, and what is also important, that we have to now implement and enforce all these measures. And it is in all these stages of the policy cycle that we need the participation also of the citizens and all groups bringing their own knowledge to the table. So today we will be talking about the different ways of knowing, different ways of addressing the crises that are there, ecological crises. We will talk about the dependency of the changing environment when it becomes an existential challenge. And when it's an existential, whether science alone can deal with it. We think not. We need something else. Personally, I'm very happy that we are today traveling far north, coming from Finland, and indeed having been there beyond the polar circle, we are going there to the Arctic. We go there through the stories that we will be hearing today. These will be stories about the knowledge, decolonization, or co-creation. These are stories that intersect indigenous knowledge, the arts, and the science. So if you are really ever dreamed to work in a very transdisciplinary way, today is your day. We have storytelling and conversations and learn from the indigenous Sami and Inuit researchers and artists, and they bring out what these intersections mean, why they are important, and why we ought to make space for the other types of knowledge and ways of knowing in order indeed to address the complex and ambitious issues. Recently, in the BBC radio, botanist Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is the member of a Potawatomi nation, said, "How is it that we accept that there is just one way of knowing and one way to know the world?" In JRC, we don't accept that so simply. And that's why we have indeed in the past 7 years worked with a project that has not only brought knowledge on Arctic, but also, and that is through our competence center on participatory and deliberative democracy, we have been looking how to bring Arctic indigenous people's knowledge into the research and policy making. especially when it's about the environmental challenges, the climate challenges that are faced by the indigenous people in the EU. I remind here also about our policy framework, the joint declaration of 2021 on a stronger EU engagement for a peaceful, sustainable and prosperous Arctic. That is why we have also other files like on bioeconomy, where we are working with the indigenous knowledge holders about the land use practices. And that's why we have also the beautiful project on the science and art that we just opened here in Brussels. It's called Naturagi, and it's in Imal. So if you didn't have yet the chance to visit, it is still open. So here in Brussels. I think today afternoon we have also performances in artists as a side events here. So we bring something also so to you here. So overall, we can say that we in the Commission, in the JRC, we have been working much more work on the different types of the knowledge in last years. So the research and innovation program, it has been also encouraging this communication with the indigenous people, with the knowledge coming from there in very collaborative way, in bringing out the co-creation aspects to the work. And I want to mention that, and that has been also, I have been privileged this year, I have also met my colleagues from the New Zealand and from Canada. So the Horizon Europe research framework has extended to these countries. We have now the association agreements. And the interesting thing is that in both countries, they pay a strong attention to the knowledge of the indigenous peoples in their research and science systems. In New Zealand, they have the research-related legislation which says that the Maori knowledge is one, let's say, the pertinent source that has to be taken into account when doing the legislation. So we are also learning then from our partners in the Horizon Europe Association. Well, with this one, I'm very happy to open the day, and I'm even more happy. Happier that I can invite now then John Bell to the stage with me. John is a director in our sister DG RTD. He's responsible on the Healthy Planet. So it is precisely this transition to fight the climate change, to deal with the bioeconomy, food systems, environment, biodiversity, water, circular economy, oceans. It's really broad things that you have, John. So please join with me here, and we'll hear what you have to say on this subject. You. Anyway is fine with me. That's perfect.
Morning, everybody.
So you will need to use the mic when you speak.
Good morning, everybody.
Fine. That way.
Are we all feeling fully participatory this morning? Yeah.
Great. So that is indeed, John. I mentioned this, our policy framework, the joint declaration on the Arctic, and it mentions indeed importantly the indigenous people as a key to know about the Arctic. Why, in your view, the indigenous people's knowledge is essential? What do you think? How, specifically from your aspect, when you are dealing with the research on the environmental, societal changes, and that touch also the Arctic?
So thanks for giving me the chance to participate. Our task in Europe for the next generation is to make peace with nature and to build resilient economies, societies and communities. And anybody who understands about resilience needs to be in at the design phase in how we're going to narrate this journey. In terms of policy, the EU's Arctic policy embeds the rights of indigenous peoples to be part of the way in which we go about our business. We have a research and innovation pillar which we work on together, and there's a huge array of work going on there and being funded in different areas. We can talk about the specific areas later. But if you talk to, you mentioned some places where it brings me back to specific conversations. In Canada, we have a big ocean research alliance that is from pole to pole and coast to coast, where the meteorologists are listening to Indigenous peoples and rights holders in North America whose histories predate the written text and who give us very important insights on the fact that changes that happen are abrupt and they are consequences. They have a record of what has happened and the way it happened when the Ice Age thawed and so forth. So some of our nice linear Northern European ideas that things will happen, you know, X% of sea level rise will happen in such a way is clearly an inefficient way of approaching resilience. So the knowledge in itself is essential to having a long-term integrated approach to what has to be a systemic approach to what kind of knowledge we include, who needs to be there in terms of narrating the impact of that knowledge and how it's applied. Because for the next few years, it's what we do with the different kinds of knowledge that will dictate the outcome. So that is absolutely critical. Secondly, it's about communities. The transition is not about the planet, it's about people. And trying to work out how different peoples are going to adapt. We have a fantastic array of scientific cooperation. You know, the European Union's greatest probably scientific achievement contributing to the IPCC, understanding our dilemma. We're the first society that understands our dilemma and we understand the scientific causes. But in terms of actually observing, predicting, modeling, creating the kind of governance tools that we will need that are knowledge-based to allow societies and communities to make decisions about things as basic as where they live, what kind of infrastructures are there, what is happening at what rate, absolutely depends on the eyes and ears of everybody in our society, and specifically those who are closest. So whether you're talking about what's happening in permafrost, infrastructure, ecosystems, pollution flows and so forth, it's essential that the people who are closest to this are there from beginning to end in terms of how knowledge is commissioned, designed and deliberated.
Thank you. So indeed, there are deep reasons that why we should pay attention, why we have been actually taking that as a policy line. Well, if we think that, and as we think that is so, that is important, what would you say? How has then the European Commission been encouraging this engagement towards the knowledge holders, indigenous knowledge holders, so that we get them in our co-creation processes? And that they can indeed, we get that knowledge on the rapid changes. You mentioned that this is one area, for example, that where we know that when the abruptness of the change has come also through the knowledge from the indigenous knowledge holders. So how can we encourage, or how have we been encouraging in this area?
So if you take it at layers, at the very top level of policy, EU Arctic policy and the research innovation is a pillar in there, it is written in that we should be working in a cooperative, integrated way. At the level of the instruments that we have, let's take Horizon Europe, we organise it in what are called clusters, and one part of the cluster I'm dealing with my colleagues from Environment and Agri, is actually about communities. And it's about developing what is called a multi-actor approach as a mainstream way of actually dealing with resilience. So there's a whole part of our framework programme that is trying to learn about the things you're talking about at this festival. How do we do this is a critical part of where we're going. Then at the next level, within the actual scientific programs that we have, if you're talking about the Arctic science, there's a whole series of projects that are working either specifically with different rights holders and indigenous communities in places on very specific topics, or we actually have a way of trying to get the knowledge that we have integrated into the way in which it can be used in those places. So for example, there's what we learn from them and what their education, resilience, infrastructure, health and so forth can take from the scientific communities. Then in terms of the way in which we cooperate, our partnerships, as I said, if I take two examples, we have, I just mentioned the All-Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance, which is all of the countries and peoples around the Atlantic. We're trying to create an ocean-level cooperation, research, innovation. The polar research is actually mainstreamed. The declaration that we signed in Washington specifically mentions the integration of indigenous peoples and rights holders in the way in which you go about our work. So that when we then fund the projects in the different areas, for example, we're going to do a big pitch now on coastal resilience. We have indigenous peoples in Southern Africa, in Brazil, in Canada, in the Arctic, in different parts of this alliance who will be absolutely mainstreamed and integrated from beginning to end in some of the work that we do. And last but not least, we have what are called missions, and in at least two of the missions, the mission which is about achieving a specific end that has a social purpose for the climate goals that we have, but that involves people in places. In the ocean, in the Restoring Our Ocean and Waters by 2030 mission, we have a lighthouse, as it's called, which is a convening point for knowledge communities and innovation, the Arctic and Atlantic Lighthouse. And there again, part of that is to invite communities in to design and deliver the process and to support it with different aspects. So at different levels, it's happening.
So indeed, it is various tools, both projects, missions, all that, and I see that it's also naturally the cooperation is quite global. Yes. So this is also something typical in this area, and naturally when the problems are global, that's where we go after the solutions. One sentence you mentioned there that one aspect is that what we learn, so not so that it's only that we bring something and offer them to the indigenous, but what then our scientific community or then actually policy community, these which are part of the science and policy dialogues, what do you see that they can learn from the knowledge and engagement of the indigenous people? You mentioned already some projects. Does something still come to your mind where what you think that we are learning, or indeed our policy community is learning?
I think, by the way, this is an extraordinarily important event that we're at here, because this is the heart of whether we make it or not will be down to how we do our participatory deliberation on these things. What we've seen so I'll talk just in practice for a moment. What you see in practice if you go to work in Africa on the oceans, or Canada on bioeconomy, or northern Finland on cryosphere, whatever, one of the things you realize is that change is cultural. Resilience is not just about bridges and databases. It's about how people narrate their situations and their solutions, their decisions, their freedoms, their restrictions, and all the rest. And there's a huge amount of learning that goes on. When you go to a meeting that is not framed by Northern European men in suits, you go to a different kind of meeting which is even structured in a different way. What you start to understand is if we are going to have any hope of bringing society, well, not even bringing society with us, taking this journey together, it has to begin with an engagement in culture and identity, and you mentioned the arts and so forth. It's not simply that we need to have SSH, social science and humanities, in our project. Everything begins and ends in narrative. That's what the elections were about last weekend in Europe. Where do people see themselves? How do they fit? What do things mean? So some parts of the world are much, much better at integrating that into the framing of issues and the inclusion of the people who can say, well, this is nice to have as a piece of knowledge, but it's of little use if you're trying to build a resilient communities. I think also in prioritization, the shape of what we prioritize is very often very technocratic because of the kind of processes that we come through. So we've moved in this All-Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance to have two big flagships, one which is a classical post-Enlightenment, fit-for-purpose observation system with everything that everybody needs to know everything about where we're going. And the other actually is now about coastal resilient communities. It's easier to build a data system than it is to work with real places that are facing fundamental choices, not simply about where the fish are, but where they should live, how you deal with extreme weather, too much water, too little water, huge health impacts, infrastructures that were built for a different world. And if you're living in the Arctic, how you get from A to B in terms of your traditional routes, in terms of food security, or all of the different things that you have. So the shift by having people in the room who are saying the way you're shaping and thinking about it, it's very interesting, but it's not very useful. So we are going to then work on a coastal resilient flagship with the EU, will work out with others. So there's all kinds of different ways. And then as a personal memory, we had a meeting in Umea, I think it was the Arctic Council. This would be 3 or 4 years ago. And the Sami Parliament were there, the community came out, and we met with them afterwards, and, what is it that we can do? And we said, just can you please do something more quickly? And can you do something more quickly that we can use? And so we ended up creating this technocratic response called the European Green Deal Call, which is €1 billion of urgent research innovation. And yesterday, we saw one of the outcomes 2 years on, which is the prototype for a thing called the digital twin of the ocean, which is basically a space and time machine to understand all of the dynamics in real time of what are happening in our oceans, currents, heat waves, nutrients, plastic flows, and so forth, which can integrate modeling, but which is also creating a basis for prediction. And what you can do with that is start integrating traditional knowledge, where we're tracking our mammals, what the satellites are doing. So it's a new way of giving citizens an evidence-based, long-term, participatory tool in order to take decisions. And as we were preparing for this, I was thinking, well, okay, the question here now is, how do we take what is currently a tool and hand it into a participatory process to be co-designed from the beginning? And where would traditional Indigenous knowledge fit in to the elaboration of these kind of tools? So so there's a very concrete case in which our Sami people kind of said, look, thanks for the talk, can you do something quickly for us? And then triggering that change.
No, thank you, because that is indeed when we have the let's say the science, when we have the knowledge coming from the indigenous people, it is in question how it is available then. So that is your project is then an example how we could put it then and make it available, and that it shows what you said about the request, that the requests do not come only then from the scientific or policy, but it is also then the indigenous communities who are asking to have these methods. So that's way how we get one way of how we indeed can keep the knowledge going, because that is the as we know in our organizations, the management of the knowledge when it's gathered is one of the most challenging issues. I think that this is also we have probably so many projects under the Horizon Europe with the wealth of the knowledge. So precisely how that can be available to everybody, also in this area of the Arctic and Indigenous. So is that something that we are working how to make that even better available then for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably the single most challenging thing that we have to do. It's very easy to, it's like everything else in the EU, you're very good at the input side of things, the design, the processing and all this, but what happens afterwards is actually the really difficult thing for most of the people who are affected by what we do, and science is no different. We have a huge portfolio. We basically have the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria here in terms of knowledge about almost anything. And the question is, how do you design an organization or a system? We have lots of systems and dashboards and all the rest, so that the portfolios of knowledge can be made available to the people who need them in the way in which they need them, at the time in which they need them, for their uses. So if you're a business startup, that's one thing. If you're a local authority trying to work out what are we going to do about sea level rise here, that's another thing. If you're a community of people who are trying to work out, do we actually have solutions to farming where we live, and so forth. So I think this is the major challenge for the next period of the institutions in the area of science and research innovation. How do we make this knowledge available? What kind of organizational supports do we need? And how do you make it available in languages that are basically, the language of science very often is English. Most of the people who are operating in this space who need the knowledge, that's not their first priority, their first opportunity. So how do we do that? But I'm sure there's a project somewhere in DigiConnect working that out as we speak.
Yeah. Exactly, but I think that this is a good way to finish. I mean, we are finishing saying that the world is not ready, absolutely, so that we do have these challenges. We have to look at them, that aspect also then when in the next years and when planning our next programs, because they are the knowledge handling, and then indeed bringing all the relevant knowledge together will be an issue. So we'll try together indeed also find better solutions on that one. So thank you, John. Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for sharing your vast experience indeed on the projects relating both to the Arctic and then to the sustainability crisis that we're discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you.